So you wanna get right to the core. So you wanna know what it's all for. So you wanna come off knowing more. Well, you better get hip. The podcast by George. So you wanna get straight to the show. So you wanna know what you need to know. You wanna know what we're all here for. Well, you better get hip. The podcast by George. Podcast by George. Podcast by George. He knows what he's fighting for. It's podcast by George. Podcast by George. Wanna know what we're fighting for?
Hello, hi, how are you? Welcome back to a podcast by George. George's world here, kind of on the holiday break, but not that you could tell. It's pretty much been like the last 9 months or so, and the only good news about all this stuff is that I get to talk to folks like Matthew Ho back on the PBG, back in George's world here, and Matt's joining us, and glad that he is, because again, it is the holiday break. And for folks that don't know, Matthew Ho is a member of the advisory boards of Exposed Facts, Veterans for Peace, and World Beyond War. And in 2009, he made worldwide news. You may remember him from then, if not now anyway. He resigned his position with the State Department in Afghanistan to protest the escalation of the Afghan war in the Obama administration. He previously had been in Iraq with a State Department team and with the U.S. Marines. He was a commander of a unit over there. He's a senior fellow with the Center for International Policy. And of course, why I like Matt is, and that bio kind of explains it a little bit. I'm always interested in what smart people think, but I'm really interested in what smart people know. And Matthew Ho knows because he's been there. Matt, welcome back to a podcast by George.
Hi, George. Thanks for having me on.
Yeah, I wanted to, and you're writing for Counterpunch now, articles appearing regularly in there, and I wanted to get this going because time is always limited, but I'm going to start off reading the first paragraph or so of this, and we'll kind of get into what you've just written. And you say that after you resigned from your position with the State Department in Afghanistan in 2009 that we were talking about, due to the escalation of that war, you were asked to meet with the President's Intelligence Advisory Board, and one of the heads of that board at the time wanted to know why the things you were saying about the Afghan war, echoed by military, diplomatic, and intelligence officers, they knew personally were not being communicated officially to the President. The simple answer was the honest answer. President Obama was being systematically lied to by the people advising him and running the war. Okay, so let's start there, Matt, because as you know, I'm always talking on this podcast about the fact, are they too dumb or are they in on it? So it sounds like you're starting to give Obama a little bit of a pass here because he was being lied to. However, I will say he got elected running against a guy like John McCain, and one of the criticisms of Obama was, dude, you're an organizer from the streets of Chicago. There's a lot of good things about that, but one of the bad things is you may not know much about these foreign wars and how things work and who to trust and not who to trust, but he assured me and other people that voted for him that he could handle that he was capable of discerning the facts. Well, in retrospect, that was proven not to be true, in your opinion?
Absolutely. It reminds me of one of my favorite presidential anecdotes as told by Susan Eisenhower about Dwight Eisenhower, is that Ike was in the Oval Office at one point towards the end of his time in office, and he points at his chair and he says, "I pity this nation when a man sits in that chair." And obviously at that point in the 50s, the thought of a woman sitting in the chair was, but I pity this nation when a man sits in this chair who doesn't know the military like I do. And what he was meaning, he didn't mean that the president needs to be a tactician or a strategist or understand logistics. What Ike was talking about was having the knowledge that the generals and admirals lie all the time. That if someone sat in that chair, and as you kind of alluded to, George, with Barack Obama, if you don't have the experience, or George Bush, or Donald Trump for that matter, if you don't have that experience, particularly if you come from this culture, this American culture where we deify the military, where the generals and admirals are clerical, basically. You can't question them. They are infallible. They are a separate class or a caste almost than the rest of us in this country, right? You've got this the great civil-military divide that the military loves talking about, because that puts them on a pedestal. That makes them exalted or again, semi-religious, semi-clerical. And not having that knowledge, not having that experience, not having the guts to question them or think it's your place. And you can see that. And I always tell people to read Obama's Wars by Bob Woodward, about the first couple years of President Obama's time in office. And you can see where he is cornered so effectively by the Pentagon and those who support the Pentagon, including people like Hillary Clinton, who are on board with this idea that we need a strong military presence overseas, that wars are good for our political as well as our imperial purposes. And, so I'll give Obama a pass in the early years of his office. But, certainly by the time he gets to years, 6, 7, 8, he should know better. And what are we seeing at that point by the time you get to year 6, 7, or 8? You're seeing the expansion of U.S. military forces across Africa. You're seeing a ramped up drone campaign across, the entire Muslim world. You're seeing horrific wars in Libya and Syria that have killed hundreds of thousands of people. And then the United States bombing of cities to rubble in northern Iraq, western Iraq, and eastern Syria. So President Obama, by that point, I don't believe deserves a pass. So, but maybe, getting back to the time when I was talking to the President's Intelligence Advisory Board, maybe he didn't understand that. Maybe he was, but the other anecdote I share is that, and I don't think I've said this on your program. If I have, you can edit it out before. But so after I resigned, I was brought into the Democratic House caucus meeting by John Murtha. This was November of 2009. And, I'm sitting there in the basement of the Capitol building, and I have to speak to about 200 Democratic congressmen and women. And, I give them my pitch on Afghanistan, why we shouldn't be escalating the war, why we should get out. And the place erupts. I mean, they are standing 10, 12 deep behind the microphone, saying this is just like Iraq, this is just like Vietnam, we can't go along with this. And then Speaker Pelosi pops up and gets everybody to calm down, gets everyone to sit down. And, what she says is, look, we just passed the Affordable Care Act. This was like on a Wednesday. We just passed the Affordable Care Act on Friday. That's the president's priority. We cannot paint him into a corner. We cannot challenge him. We cannot do anything that makes him weak. We have to get this through. And that effectively cut all resistance to the escalation of the Afghan war. And I witnessed it happen, right in front of me. She just literally knocked the foundations out of any revolt against the president's plans in Afghanistan and for the escalation of war. Then, it was interesting then too to watch the process go, because what Obama wanted was the same thing that George Bush wanted in Iraq, was to escalate the war, be seen as winning, be seen to have done, and this is basically what Nixon did in Vietnam, right? Escalate the war, say you've won, declare victory, go home, and then blame it on the Afghans, blame it on the Iraqis, blame it on the Vietnamese for losing. You get that, you get that space, right? You get that, I forget what the term Kissinger used for that period of time to make it seem like you had done your part. It was the other guy that screwed it up. Right?
Well, you declare victory and go home. I mean, and if we hadn't have done that in Vietnam, we'd still be there. And it ain't pretty. I mean, the exit is never good. I interviewed Jerry Berry on the program. He was the helicopter pilot that got the ambassador out of the embassy in Saigon, the last people off of the rooftops. We've all seen those images. It's not a pretty thing. We're not talking about dancing here. I mean, it's kind of ugly how these things happen.
A decent interval is what it's called.
Yeah.
You have a decent interval. And that's what Obama wanted, in Afghanistan. This would make him look like a very good, effective war. And from what I've not read his new book yet, but from what I understand in that book, he speaks to this desire to be an effective wartime president, to be a better commander in chief than a Republican could be. That's what the Democratic Party wanted. And so that's what you see throughout Obama's time in office is the president being afraid, and this goes back to LBJ, right?
Yeah.
LBJ said this. It's a great interview that Bill Moyer has on his website with LBJ, where he says, I know the war in Vietnam is screwed. I know it's not worth it. I know we can't win, but there are members of Congress who will hang me if I try and do anything about it. And that's what Obama, and so he gives in. Obama lets the military and the intelligence services do whatever they want, basically, for his time in office. And now we are dealing with those consequences right now, particularly as many of those people who engineered those wars and who sustained them are the people that Joe Biden is putting into office.
Well, we're going to talk about that a little bit, and I want to talk about this strange situation with Afghanistan, where, again, a lot of the Democrats are opposed to even withdrawing or drawing down the troops there. But I wanted to tick off a couple of names here just based on your comments. Nancy Pelosi, honest to God, don't get me started on Nancy Pelosi, all politics. I mean, what you're saying there makes absolute sense to me. No surprise to me whatsoever. John McCain, I don't want anybody to get me wrong about that. I was not a John McCain supporter. I would never elect somebody that had been imprisoned and tortured that was a POW like him. Honest to God, just from my own experience, if I ever got an opportunity to get back at somebody that did that stuff to me, yeah, I'd do it. That's what I used to tell people, not just my own experience. I'm a vengeful little bastard. I'm telling you, I never trusted John McCain because of that. I always thought he might have a screw loose, and rightfully so. And Bob Woodward, you mentioned his book, and this is a great thing that he did, you know, for history, really, with his coverage of Trump and this coronavirus. But where in the hell is Bob Woodward on Julian Assange? Bob Woodward is known today, and we're talking about him because of his coverage of Deep Throat and Watergate, and he used a whistleblower. He used somebody secretly to get that book written and to jettison himself to prominence. And he's not even coming to Assange's defense, not like he should. He's not talking about him. So a black mark of pox on Bob Woodward as well. I want to get to the next paragraph of this because this is really what jumped out at me, because we talked about this, and I talk about it all the time on the podcast. And you say that next month will mark a year since U.S. newspapers published the Afghan Papers, a mass trove of secret U.S. government documents that irrefutably detailed a coordinated effort by the U.S. government through 3 presidential administrations to lie to the American people and their elected leaders about the war in Afghanistan. Of course, these lies of the Afghan war followed the lies that made possible the U.S. invasion and destruction of Iraq. And you were involved in both of those operations, Matt. And again, this is what we were talking about. This isn't something that he thinks, folks. This is something that he knows, and goes back to my thing. Are they too dumb, or are they in on it? Because flashing back to Bob Woodward again and that era, Ellsberg and the Pentagon Papers and all of that, the mainstream media, such as it was all over that stuff. They wouldn't let it die. It continued, and the coverage continued and continued every day in the front page of the New York Times, the Washington Post, and all the other major dailies, until we got rid of our rotten president, until we ended a rotten war. I mean, that's the kind of thing that can happen if they do that. But instead, in this instance, with the Afghan Papers, they've gone silent. What, Matt? Are they too dumb, or are they in on it?
Oh gosh, I think there's a complicity with it. There is a number of reasons. You had Matt Taibbi on the other day. He's written about this, and he's so great. And I think, one, if you go to the very top level, and Paul Jay, who used to be on the Real News Network, and he's done a lot, and he now has his own program on the analysis with Paul Jay. He has written a lot about this, and this is where I get my understanding really from it, where it's from, is the same 4 or 5 money management firms. So the firms that have about $15 trillion, they have more, these 4 or 5 firms control more money than the GDP of China. And they own 90% of the principal shares in the S&P 500. So these 4 or 5 firms, BlackRock, Vanguard, State Street, a couple others, they control nearly every corporation in the U.S. because they are the principal shareholders within these corporations. And that goes for where you start talking about the wars. That, of course, goes for the weapons manufacturers. It also goes for the fossil fuel companies, but it goes for the media companies. And these media companies own both Hollywood and CNN, Fox, MSNBC, et cetera, right? They're all under the same banner. And at the end of the day, all these money management firms, all these banks want is for these companies to be profitable. And so the idea that the board of directors at Sony or at any of these corporations that own these media platforms would do anything to jeopardize the well-being of the profits of other established interests that these banks own is just really far-fetched. The idea that they're going to do anything to jeopardize that. And so I think that's why you hear this from, my God, we could spend the whole episode talking about, Dylan Ratigan, Crystal Ball, Cenk Uygur, Phil Donahue. There's been at least 5 or 6 high-profile people who've left MSNBC because they did not want to be told what to speak about and how to speak about it. The news media themselves are never going to say we self-censor, but they always do. It's the same thing like any of these think tanks that take money from the defense industry, and that they're the experts who go on CNN and talk about, or more importantly, they're the ones who go into Congress and brief members of Congress. 7 out of 10 briefings that Congress members get about the wars come from think tanks and private or not-for-profit organizations, not from the U.S. government. So if you're a member of Congress, the majority of what you get in terms of information about the wars does not come from the CIA or from the State Department or from the Department of Defense. It comes from think tanks that are funded by the defense industry. Yes. And they all say we're nonpartisan, we don't censor, but that's a load of crap. I mean, anybody who's worked in anything knows that you do not go against the wishes of the person who signs your paycheck. You just don't. And if you do, you're not going to have a long tenure there. So, and there's been all kinds of academic studies, and I'm sure you were taught this in journalism school, George, the dangers of self-censorship. It's why you're not supposed to report on anything or speak about anything that you have a conflict of interest about, because whether you know it or not, you have a bias. Whether that's a conscious or a subconscious bias, it is there. So, that's another reason, too, is that so much of these industries are tied together. They don't want to upset the people who ultimately are in charge. And then I think a lot of the things with the media is they're afraid of losing access. They're afraid of losing their entrance. They're afraid of losing their pass into the press rooms, or they're not going to be invited on a next trip with a 4-star general someplace and fly in a helicopter and get all this great video. So, and then there's another part too. I think there's some lingering fear that, we're going to be blamed for losing the war. The media took a lot of unjust, unfair, and completely inaccurate attacks during and after the Vietnam War, that they're the reason why the United States lost that war, which is complete BS. But I think that still lingers in the media, that they're afraid. And then the other side of that too is the Pentagon very clearly in the 1980s. You can see this in the Pentagon doctrine and everything, how much they spend on it, what they write about it, who they hire. In terms of how they deal with the press, they knew that the press was better as a friend, that they certainly understood digital information. They certainly understood our satellites that could bring news down. We could watch what is happening, right now, 10,000 miles away. You turn your television on, it's there. The Pentagon got that. They understood it, and they knew how important that was for propaganda purposes, for keeping support behind their efforts. And so they used that as well. At the beginning of the Iraq War in 2003, they had this boot camp for journalists, and the journalists went to different military bases, and they got to play soldier for a couple weeks, and then they got put into units, and they were embedded, and they went over to Iraq, and they lived and they slept with these 18, 19, 20-year-old men. They became close to them. Of course they were going to write in their favor. Of course they were going to write because they had a relationship now with them. So there are so many different reasons. And then the other thing too is, getting back to the money, you look at a paper like the Washington Post, which published the Afghan papers, spent a boatload of money going to court to try and get them to be released, did a magnificent job with it. And they ignore it basically all the time now. They hardly ever reference it. They certainly never held anyone's feet to the fire on it. They still publish things that are very pro-military in sentiment or very pro-CIA in sentiment. And, but you look at who owns it, Jeff Bezos. Jeff Bezos has contracts with both the Department of Defense and the Pentagon that are valued in billions of dollars. I don't know if it's fair to say that his government contracts outstrip what he does in terms of like selling stuff, delivering stuff to people's homes. I don't think that's the case, but it is billions of dollars. And certainly those government contracts that Jeff Bezos has worth well more than what the Washington Post is worth. I think Bezos paid $200 million or $250 million for the Washington Post, which is, a third of what one of his contracts are with like the CIA. So there's a lot to it, but it comes down to money and comes down to relationships, wanting to be friends with these people, get invited to the cocktail parties. Because the other part of this too, George, is, you could talk about this better than me, but these last 20 years or so, you've seen such an explosion in media that the Pentagon doesn't need you. They can go tell their story to somebody else, right? I mean, it used to be you had 3 networks. And so that was all that was, and as well as the print people in the Pentagon briefing room. Now you have to be good. You have to be on the nice list, right? We're getting to the holidays. You can't be on the naughty list for the Pentagon. You got to be on a nice list if you want to be inside that briefing room. So you're not going to write anything that's unfavorable. And that's why you see stuff that like, that say CNN, Barbara Starr, who's been CNN for 30 years at least, or maybe not that long, but at least 25 years. She's basically a stenographer for the Pentagon at this point. And CNN publishes that completely without any hint of journalistic, embarrassment, which they should be, because what they publish about the military and the wars is simply not journalism.
Well, and the access issue that you talked about is really probably the most of it. I'd like to think that these people are not that nefarious, that they're not doing evil on purpose. But, man, they want that access. It's hard to get. And once you get it, as an example on MSNBC with the CIA information, all of this Russiagate silly shit that came down the pike for 4 years, all of this storytelling, great ratings, jettisoned Rachel Maddow right to the top of the ratings. Well, that stuff comes from, James Brennan, people like that. Or John Brennan, rather. So if John Brennan gets mad at Chris Hayes, as an example, and shuts off that conduit for that access, for that CIA feed, it goes all across MSNBC. None of the hosts get it. None of the talking heads have that access any longer. It could just almost destroy them from a ratings basis, from a money basis. And that's what happens. That's why that access is so critical. You don't want even one of your reporters doing anything that could jeopardize that, because it's across the platform. And you mentioned Phil Donahue. Yeah, that's what happened to poor Phil, I think. I mean, he was the lone voice, the lone ranger that wanted to call that stuff into question. They got rid of Phil because they didn't want to lose that access. I think that has a lot to do with it.
There's been a number of people. I think one of the CNN reporters, she's not there anymore, Jessica Yellen, I think it was. It might have been someone else, though, who wrote about this, and then she had to issue an apology afterwards. Saying like, I didn't really mean that. Like, come on. Yeah. But you look at the Pentagon, and the Pentagon spends $10 billion a year on public relations. That includes their recruitment campaigns. It's tough to break apart that money, but they basically spend $10 billion a year influencing and working on their perception overtly. Exactly. That doesn't include all the other, the stuff that they use. And of course, now, thanks to President Obama, the U.S. government is allowed to use propaganda against the American people. I think it was the 2012 National Defense Authorization Act that changed the law where the U.S. government can use propaganda within the boundaries of the United States. But the next biggest PR, if you look at the biggest PR corporations around the world, the biggest one is $900 million a year. So the Pentagon is 10 times bigger in its PR budget than the biggest PR corporation alone, right? I mean, so if you add it all up, it's probably bigger than the 10 next biggest PR companies. So it is really amazing what they're able to do, and to do it overtly. And we've had all kinds of things exposed, right, George, about the football games where the Pentagon was paying the NFL to do all these halftime salutes to soldiers, to have the big flags out. I mean, it's done overtly, and we go along with it, and I think that's what the idea, when you have people come in office, how are they going to know any better? The other side thing too, I want to say about the media, and I used to do, CNN and MSNBC quite a bit, and it's changed so much in the last 7-8 years. And you and Matt Taibbi had a great conversation about that. Every day there are people from the defense industry, from the weapons industry, who are retired generals or admirals. They wake up, they put on a suit, and they get ready to go on air, and they are paid for that. And there's a car standing by to take them to the studio in CNN or MSNBC. And some of them, what I witnessed, they spend their whole day there. They just go over, if they're going to be on MSNBC, they just go over to Rockefeller Center. And they hang out there all day. And they got a suit on. And they have a whole team of people working for a high-profile public affairs agency who pitch them every day. So the producers and the bookers at CNN, they're getting hit every day. I mean, so there's so much money. It's not an accident that these are the people that are on there. Part of the problem is that those of us who are in opposition, one, we just don't have the money to do that. We can't hire these people to pitch us and to get onto those programs. You do need that. That's not an excuse. You do need basically like an agency to represent you many times, not all the time, but many times. And so, it's just, for the producers and bookers on these networks, many of whom are 25 years old, and they have to find someone to talk about the war in Syria, but then also talk about COVID, talk about holiday shopping, and talk about Kanye West, all within, and they got to find these people all in the next hour to go on television, in the next hour. Yeah, of course they're going to put the person who's right in front of them, who's been on before, who talks well, who presents well, who's not going to say anything out of line, who hits the established line. Yeah, so, there's a whole industry that supports this. So it's not, there's a lot to it besides the nefariousness, but we do know from studies that whenever there is a bombing, whenever we shoot cruise missiles someplace, that about 90% of the people who go on the networks or who are quoted in newspapers are pro-war.
95%,
yeah. Defense industry, yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. And we were talking about Bezos, my God, this guy that owns Amazon, but he's going to be the first trillionaire. I think that agreement that he has with the CIA that Matt was talking about, that's in the $100 billion or something like that. But it's not. He's not providing caps and T-shirts. He's providing computing space, cloud space. My God, you know how significant that is? And he just, by the way, happens to own the Washington Post. Well, my God, we're running out of time here. There's one thing I wanted to get up, and I'll put this on the screen here. And this was, I think I will. Will I be able to get this?
We do this every time.
Yeah, here it is.
We have to talk about something, and then we end up ripping on something else important. But exactly, we always, yeah.
I wanted to talk just briefly because this is our first time that we've been able to talk really since the election, and I told Matt before we went on, the way that I view it is the Republicans won a lot in this election. Don't think that they lost just because Trump has lost. They still have the judiciary. It looks like they may control the Senate. And, of course, the demographics, according to the exit polling, are tilting strongly in favor of the Republicans in some surprising areas. And the Democrats, of course, retain the House. They're still trying to get those people down there in Georgia to get control of the Senate. Maybe I'm not exactly sure how that all is going to work out, but they beat Trump, so the Democrats got something. And it seems like there's something for everybody in this election, with the exception of progressives. The Democrats won, the Republicans won, and the progressives, as usual, get to suck it. It doesn't look like we're going to get much of anything, and these appointments that are coming down, these cabinet positions that are being filled by Biden, are just horrific. And this one that I wanted to bring up was out of the Daily Beast, that Biden is weighing Mike Morrell as his CIA chief. A key Democratic senator says, don't bother. And Morrell served as deputy CIA director for 3 years under President Barack Obama. He worked as acting director of the agency twice. Let's see here. One of the things that I wanted to mention in this is that It says down here, now I'm putting this up. It's the reason that this would tick progressives off so much is it would inflame the Democratic Party's progressive wing, such as it is. There's not much of us. A career CIA analyst, this guy, played a significant role in the hunt for Osama bin Laden and was George W. Bush's intelligence briefer on 9/11. He was an aggressive defender of the agency's use of torture and drone strikes. Quote, "No torture apologist can be confirmed to CIA Director." Senator Ron Wyden, a Democrat from Oregon, a member of the Senate Intelligence Committee, told the Daily Beast about him. It's a non-starter. Putting morale atop the CIA would likely placate a large chunk of the national security establishment, which views his expertise as an asset and believes he would seamlessly step into the lead role at the agency. So I don't. This guy's a proponent of torture. He's a proponent of drone strikes, and I mean, so the Progressive Party is going to oppose this. I don't know if it's going to do any good, man. What about what's happened thus far? What do you think about that Blinken guy? What do you just think about the appointments that we're seeing come down the pike?
Well, they're all, and they're all the same ilk. They all have the same pedigrees. There's a lot about diversity and the fact that we're going to have the first woman director of national intelligence, possibly most likely the first woman secretary of defense. It's tokenism. I was taught that your diversity is supposed to bring change. Certainly, if you go to, I always thought that the foreign policy community needs to be much more diverse because it's the same people who come from the same schools with the same ideas. They all go to Georgetown Law. They all go to the Harvard Kennedy School. Maybe they go to Stanford. Maybe that's different. They're out west, but it's all the same thinking, and they all have the same background, the same experiences. They've all been wrong on the same issues time and time again. We were talking earlier about what Joe Biden said about his nominations for the national security positions that he announced earlier this week. And he talks about how they're going to, we have to jettison old thinking, that this is going to bring in, and it's none of that. These are all the people who have been involved.
It's a swamp.
Since before George Bush. I mean, these are the people that helped engineer the sanctions and the bombing of Iraq that took place every day in the 90s that led directly to the 9/11 attacks. Right. I mean, that's the reason why, one of the reasons why Al-Qaeda launched the 9/11 attacks was because of the U.S. bombing and the sanctions of Iraq, the positioning of U.S. troops in Saudi Arabia. That's what led to the 9/11. These are the people that are the architects of that. And then, of course, they were supportive of the Iraq war. And then when they got back into power under Obama, and this is for the whole line of them, go and look at the listings of the agency review teams on the Biden website, or go and look at what has been written about the people who've been nominated. But just not the top people. It is those very important people who are at the second, third, fourth level down, right? Who are the deputies and the assistant secretaries and those positions who make the actual policy, who are, doing the data. They are the same people as the ones who are above. None of them are offering any new thinking. And they've all been, this is what I get into my piece, they've all been complicit in the lies. It wasn't just the lies about Iraq. It wasn't just the lies about Afghanistan that the Washington Post explained so well. It was the lies about Libya, which the UK Parliament said was a war based on lies. It was the lies about the war in Syria. It's the lies that have supported the wars that have spread across Africa. And the idea that somehow these people were successful, maybe they get credit for the Iran nuclear deal, but that's kind of about it. Look at Africa. All these people were involved in the escalation of our wars in Africa, where we have commandos in half of the nations of Africa. That's more than 25 nations.
People don't know that. Yeah,
exactly. I have a link to it. A great interview that Nick Turse does with General Dan Bolduc, who had been the commander of Special Operations Forces in Africa. And Bolduc says that we had casualties, young American men, most likely men, maybe some women, but most likely all men, killed and wounded in nations across Africa that we covered up, that no one knows about. That's amazing that is provided like that in a media platform like Vice, and no one picks up on it.
Yeah.
It's similar to this past week where, again, you're not going to find this in the Post or the New York Times. There are 2 American journalists who are suing the U.S. government because they claim the U.S. government has attempted to try to kill them while they were doing their jobs in Syria. One of those guys, Bilal Abdul Karim, is most likely a member of Al-Qaeda, but still he's an American citizen. And so that doesn't mean he loses his rights, doesn't mean like due process is vanquished. But under President Obama and under these people like Mike Morrell, like Avril Haines, like Jake Sullivan, all these people are coming into big positions, Michelle Flournoy. They had this policy that allowed the United States government to murder without due process American citizens with drones. And you just had this last week, Justice Department representative in a U.S. appeals court say the U.S. government has the unilateral right to kill people, including American citizens, without due process. And it is not reported on. It's not discussed. And so what you have with these people who've been lying and who these lies have just not started the wars but have helped them escalate and sustain them, they're coming back into more, senior positions. And as we kind of briefly spoke about too, George, their lies still go on. Jake Sullivan, who's going to be the National Security Advisor, and Avril Haines, she is going to be the Director of National Intelligence. And you can look at this in reporting in the American Prospect, as well as, I'm blanking on the one that reported so well on this about Avril Haines. As soon as they got involved with the Biden campaign, their official biographies left out the corporations that they worked for. And both of them, Sullivan and Haines, both worked for corporations. Haines worked for Palantir, and Sullivan worked for Mecarno Consulting Group, which is a British outfit run by ex-British spies that do basically macro intelligence. They do big data. They capture all our information and sell it to other people, as well as they are involved with the intelligence agencies. They do work as contractors for them. Both of them, Haines and Sullivan, as soon as they got back in with the Biden campaign, those things fall off of their resumes. So, and you're not going to hear about these jobs where they were earning. It's the same as those men and women who go on CNN or MSNBC and Fox and talk about the wars. It doesn't get mentioned that they are on the board of directors for Raytheon or Lockheed. Right. That gets left out as if somehow the several $100,000 a year they earn from those positions is not consequential. And the same thing with, right? The same thing.
That's why they're there.
Exactly. I'm going to recommend 2 things to people. One is in that Daily Beast article that you showed, Spencer Ackerman was one of the co-writers. Spencer has been really great on a lot of things. I suggest people follow him. Spencer's interesting because he has been at places like the Washington Post and then left, and I believe it's because he's been censored. And then the other thing is Kevin Gastalva at the Gray Zone wrote a terrific piece going through all the different people on the Biden agency review teams. These are the people that were put in charge by the Biden transition team to look at the various departments of government and say, we're going to do this when we come into power. So there's a Pentagon one, there's an Interior Department one, there's a State Department one, there's an energy one, et cetera. And these people all have ties to the industry. It's something that of the entire list of the agency review teams, not just the ones focusing on the Pentagon, 1/3 of all the people on the agency review teams for the Biden administration, all of them, again, not just the people for the Pentagon, have ties to the weapon industries, get money from the arms industry. Right.
And they care about the almighty buck more than anything, more than us, because just to wrap up here, here's what I'll say in close on that is, and it goes back to the nuclear weapons of my childhood, basically. We know that if you're a proponent of nuclear weapons, they're coming for you and your country. When we first, when we were the leader in that, when we were the only ones with them, we thought that was pretty cool. Nah, it'll come for you. It'll come for your country. Drones? Those things are going to be launched out of neighborhoods in the back of vans someday, probably. They're coming for you. They're coming for your country. Torture. You're a proponent. You support torture. It'll come for you. I mean, it's censorship the same way. You support censorship. It'll come for you. You'll be censored all the way down to Russiagate. And we found that out. People that supported that thought that was great, that it was a good way to bring down Donald Trump. Well, how you feeling about that, Bernie? How you feeling about that, Democrats, Bernie supporters? It brought down Bernie, if you'll recall, right before South Carolina when those Russiagate allegations were made. Tulsi Gabbard got Russiagated. I mean, it will come for you. And they know that stuff, and they do it anyway. And I guess the question goes back to, are they too dumb or are they in on it? And I think we know the answer to that. Matt, last word, pal. You get to close up here.
Yeah, I was going to say, you see that with Susan Rice, who was totally going to be in the Biden administration, and I'm not sure if she will be. Her name's been off the list, it seems, the last couple days.
She can't get confirmed, I don't think. I mean, I think that's probably because of Benghazi, Yeah,
it just, Benghazi, there was something real about Benghazi, but that was never discussed. It was, what was our CIA doing in Benghazi? Well, they were shipping weapons from Libya to Syria, and who were those weapons going to? They were going to Al Qaeda and the Islamic State and their allies. That's the real story about Benghazi. But Susan Rice, just to your point about Russiagate is going to affect you, and all this is going to affect you. Susan Rice said this about Black Lives Matter. She said that Black Lives Matter was a disinformation ops, had all the markings or the fingerprints of the Russian government on it. Right? I mean, so what they do by using this is they take away people's agency. They say that there is no right. People don't have a real reason to be upset at the incarceration state or police killing people in the street. Though that must come from the Russian government. You know what I mean? So it is, like you said, George, it will affect you in some ways. It may not be apparent you right away, but at some point, the way it's going, it will affect us. And the farce that we keep that we sustain about our democracy and freedom of the press, it's really exposed when you look at the complicity between the media, between the government and industry, and then when you see, as I brought up in the article, all the different lies that have gotten us to this point that the members of the Biden administration have been complicit with, have been, helped create. And I end the piece by saying Biden promised to be the most progressive president this country's ever had, or at least since FDR. And how can you be a progressive president if you're going to allow these wars, this military spending, these liars to have that type of control of the government, under the most progressive president since FDR? It's just not possible.
I'm going to put up a link to that Counterpunch article, and I encourage people to follow Matt Ho and catch him when he's on Podcast by George, which, we went way over today, but this is going to carry us through the holidays, so I want to wish you all the best here for Thanksgiving. Matt, again, thanks for coming on Podcast by George.
Thank you, George, and happy holidays to everyone who's listening.
And folks, if you like Podcast by George, please subscribe to us on YouTube, trying to build the audience there. Really appreciate everybody that watches us on Facebook and, of course, listens to us on iTunes. Those are our biggest platforms, but we're on Spotify and the iHeartRadio app, and you can get the audio podcasts in a lot of places, and really appreciate it. And again, everybody have try to shelter well, try to stay home, number one. Yeah, wear a mask, wash your hands, all that stuff. And number one, if you can, stay home. That's the best thing you can do. I can't make that point strongly enough, but that's going to wrap it up. That's going to do it. That's all there is, and there ain't no more. That's another podcast by George.